I'll never forget the image of King Philip II himself smashing through the doors of his son's bedroom. Clad head to toe in gleaming battle armor, he stormed in not as a dad but as a general spearheading a conquest. Prince Don Carlos, the heir to the mightiest empire on the planet, bolted awake to find his room swarming with armed guards, his own father towering at their front. Philip's face was a stony mask of duty, his eyes hidden behind the cold steel of his visor. In that gut-wrenching, frozen moment, Don Carlos realized this wasn't just a scolding or a slap on the wrist. It was an arrest. The man who'd given him life was now there to strip away his freedom, a king's obligation crushing any trace of a father's love. That act of betrayal in the family would ripple through every royal court in Europe. But how did things spiral to this point? To grasp why a king would lock up his only son, the heir to the throne, we've got to go back to the very start, to a royal birth hailed as both a godsend and a dark, hidden curse. Before we dig into this tale, I'd love for you to hit that subscribe button on the channel. It's the best way to tag along as we uncover the lost stories of history. Even before Don Carlos drew his first breath, he was already trapped, caged by his own bloodline. It was 1545, and in the Spanish royal palace, courtiers buzzed with excitement about the soon-to-be-born heir. Yet behind closed doors, the royal doctors shared uneasy looks. They knew something the jubilant nobles didn't. This child came from a bloodline so tightly knotted, so fiercely pure, it had turned toxic. Let me break down what pure meant for the Habsburgs. Don Carlos had just 6 great-great-grandparents, 6 when most folks would have 16. Let that sink in. 10 ancestors were wiped out by generations of uncles marrying nieces, first cousins tying the knot with first cousins, all to keep the crown's bloodline untouched by outsiders. Their family tree wasn't growing outward, it was choking itself. The court scribes jotted down his birth with fancy quills and golden ink, but they couldn't capture the hidden damage woven into his very DNA. When Don Carlos finally arrived on July 8, 1545, the midwives noticed his head was oddly shaped, his cries feebler than expected. Still, he was alive and a boy, and that was cause enough for celebration. His mother, Maria Manuela of Portugal, held him just once. At barely 17, she was drained from a grueling delivery that had ravaged her body. Fever gripped her within hours. While the court toasted the new heir, Maria's skin burned like dry paper, her whispered Portuguese prayers barely audible as her maids pressed cool cloths to her brow. She had 4 days, just 4 days to be a mother before infection took her life. The same bells that rang for Carlos's birth now tolled for Maria's funeral. Swaddled in silk, unaware of his loss, the infant prince had cost his mother her life before he could even make out her face. And here's where it gets even darker. Maria wasn't just Carlos's mother. She was his first cousin. Their fathers were brothers, their mothers sisters, making their marriage less a union and more a genetic hall of mirrors. The same blood that doomed Maria now coursed through Carlos, carrying centuries of built-up damage. King Philip, only 20 himself, stood at his wife's funeral, cradling his newborn son. To the courtiers, he was a mourning widower with his heir. But Philip saw something else. He saw the cost of their obsession with purity. His son had survived, sure, but at what price? And what unseen costs were still waiting to surface? The wet nurses started noticing troubling signs. The baby's feeding was all over the place, his sleep a mess of chaos. He'd scream for hours without reason, then slip into eerie, silent stupors that spooked the servants. One nurse swore she saw him stop breathing for nearly a minute, only to gasp back to life like a man breaking through water. But royal nurseries were no strangers to infant troubles. The court doctors reassured Philip that the boy would grow strong. After all, he carried the blood of emperors and conquistadors who'd claimed half the world for Spain. They figured that legacy would shine through. They couldn't have been more wrong. That imperial blood was the root of the problem. Each generation of inbreeding added another link to an invisible chain, and Carlos was weighed down by them all. The Habsburg jaw, that notorious deformity, was just the surface of deeper damage. What lay beneath was far worse. The curse wasn't some mystical hex, it was cold, hard math. A genetic gamble with worsening odds, and Carlos had lost before he even got to roll the dice. Every cell in his body bore the scars of his ancestors' pride, their fixation on keeping power locked within the family at any cost. He'd survived his birth, a motherless prince born into a genetic prison. But the curse of his blood wasn't just a number on a family tree. Soon, it would show itself to the world, carved into his very bones. The royal armorer was sweating bullets. The breastplate, crafted from the finest Milanese steel, just wouldn't fit. He'd measured Prince Carlos 3 times, each attempt more baffling than the last. The left side of the prince's chest curved inward where it should have flared out. His right shoulder sat nearly 2 inches higher than the left. No amount of hammering or reshaping could make standard armor fit this 13-year-old's asymmetrical body. Carlos stood there, arms spread, as the armorer fumbled. The prince's breaths came in quick, sharp gasps. Not from effort, but because his sunken chest couldn't fully expand. His malformed ribcage fought his lungs with every breath. The court pretended not to see, but Carlos caught their whispers bouncing off the stone walls. The physical proof of his cursed bloodline was getting harder to hide. His skull had grown unevenly, bulging on one side like a melon left too long in the sun. Palace painters had to get creative with angles to mask it in portraits. His left leg wasn't keeping up with his right, giving him a lurching, uneven gait that clicked and scraped across the marble floors. But here's the thing about divine right: it expects divine perfection. In 16th century Spain, a king's body was seen as proof of God's favor. A strong, balanced heir showed heaven's blessing on the royal line. So what did Carlos's twisted frame say about the Habsburgs? What did it say about Spain itself? The court doctors spun all sorts of explanations. The prince's humors were out of whack. His stars were misaligned at birth. Anything but the truth. Generations of Habsburg inbreeding had finally borne its bitter fruit. They prescribed treatments that sound like torture now: bleeding to balance his humors, mercury baths to straighten his spine, iron boots to force his shorter leg to grow. Carlos endured it all with a rage that sent servants scurrying. When those metal boots came off each night, his screams echoed through the palace, not just from pain, but from fury at his body's betrayal. He was supposed to be perfect. He was supposed to be king. The royal tutors started reporting even more worrying signs. The prince's mind seemed to drift endlessly. He'd get hung up on odd things, like the web of cracks in the ceiling or the rhythm of his own breath, while completely ignoring critical lessons on how to run a kingdom. His speech was unpredictable, sometimes pouring out in rapid, jumbled bursts, other times drying up entirely. On good days, he spoke with the polished grace you'd expect from a royal heir. But on others, his words stumbled over themselves, his tongue betraying him as he struggled to form a clear thought. Then there were the headaches, brutal, earth-shattering pains that drove him to his room for days. Servants would hear him slamming his misshapen head against the stone walls, as if he could beat the agony out with more pain. When he finally emerged, his eyes were red, unfocused, like he was staring through our world into some dark, haunted place. By the time Carlos hit 14, marriage proposals started flooding in. Royal families from across Europe sent portraits of their daughters, each hoping to tie their name to Spain's sprawling empire. But Philip stalled, dodged, and came up with excuses. How could he send truthful reports about his son to potential brides? How do you explain that the heir to Spain's throne couldn't stand upright, couldn't breathe right, couldn't even wear armor like a proper prince? Ambassadors who met Carlos sent guarded messages back to their courts. They wrote delicately that the prince showed signs of frailty or had a delicate constitution. They didn't dare put the real truth to paper, that Spain's heir looked like something broken and pieced back together wrong, like a porcelain figure shattered and glued by clumsy hands. Down in the servants' quarters, whispers spun their own tales. Some swore the ghost of his mother lingered in his twisted bones, a curse for the unnatural marriage that made him. Others said his deformities were the sins of his ancestors carved into his flesh, each flaw a mark of their pride. But the physical marks were nothing compared to the darkness growing inside him. A vicious cruelty was taking root in the young prince, and it was about to show itself in the most horrifying way. The royal shoemaker stood trembling as he presented the boots. He'd made a small mistake, never imagining his punishment would be to slice them up and eat them. It started as a routine fitting in Carlos's chambers. The craftsman had toiled for weeks on boots tailored to fit the prince's shorter leg. But when Carlos slipped them on, the left boot pinched just enough to spark a rage that turned the elegant room into a stage for humiliation. "Eat them," Carlos ordered, his voice chillingly steady. The shoemaker gave a nervous chuckle, thinking he'd misheard. But those bloodshot, vacant eyes held no trace of a joke. "Cut them into pieces and eat them now." The court stood frozen in horror as the shoemaker, tears streaming, took his crafting knife to the leather. The slow, deliberate sound of slicing filled the room, cutting through weeks of his careful work. Then came the worst part, the forced, rhythmic crunch of a man chewing his own creation while the 17-year-old prince watched with a twisted satisfaction. Here's what makes it even more unsettling. This wasn't a one-off. It was a pattern. The palace kitchens shared stories that turned even hardened soldiers pale. Carlos had developed a sick obsession with watching animals suffer. Not hunting, which was honorable, or butchering, which was practical. He wanted to see pain. He'd order live rabbits brought to his rooms, then roast them alive over his fireplace, timing how long their shrieks lasted. Servants cleaning his chambers would find the charred remains arranged in eerie, deliberate patterns, like some grotesque display. One young page made gravest mistake of snickering at the prince's limp. Carlos always caught the mockery, whether it was real or in his head. That night, the boy woke to see the prince looming over his bed, clutching a glowing orange poker from the fireplace. Only Carlos's own frail body saved the page. When he swung the poker, he stumbled, giving the boy just enough time to bolt, screaming, into the hallway. The prince's violence was getting harder to rein in. At a meeting with Portuguese diplomats, Carlos suddenly snatched a knife from the banquet table and pressed it to an ambassador's throat, demanding he admit Portugal was lesser than Spain. The diplomat's careful training fell apart as the blade bit into his skin, the prince's eyes wild with thrill. King Philip had to step in himself, coaxing his son to lower the knife like you'd talk down a feral animal. But what scared the court most wasn't just the violence. It was the cunning behind it. Carlos wasn't merely unhinged. He was calculated in his cruelty. He knew exactly who he could target without repercussions. Servants, craftsmen, anyone too low to fight back. In front of high-ranking nobles, he could play the part of a troubled but tolerable prince. The second they left, the mask fell. The court physicians had their theories. They blamed unbalanced humors for his fiery temper or claimed his misshapen skull pressed on his brain, sparking violent urges. But in private, even they wondered if something more sinister was at play. Was this madness just the result of his broken body? Or was it something deeper, a core of evil that would have existed even if his body were whole? Philip tried everything to fix his son. Priests were summoned to pray over him, and Europe's sharpest minds were called in to consult. They set up strict routines to curb Carlos's worst impulses, but nothing worked. If anything, trying to control him only made his cruelty more inventive. The servants came up with their own warning system. When they heard Carlos's uneven, lurching footsteps echoing through the halls, word spread like wildfire. Chambermaids dropped their tasks and fled. Kitchen boys ducked into pantries. Even the guards suddenly found urgent duties elsewhere. The heir to Spain's throne had become a monster everyone ran from. A prince this unstable was dangerous but could be managed, until his father dealt a blow so personal, so humiliating, it set Carlos's rage ablaze. Every man in the Spanish court gazed at the new queen, Elizabeth de Valois, with awe. But Carlos looked at her with something else, a seething resentment for what had been taken from him. The betrayal was a masterstroke of political strategy. Elizabeth had originally been promised to Carlos as part of a peace deal between Spain and France. For months, the young prince had pored over her portrait, memorizing every feature of the stunning French princess who was to be his. For the first time in his warped life, something pure and his alone had been within reach. But Philip had other plans. Recently widowed, the king decided Spain needed a queen more than it needed a future princess. In a shocking move that stunned Europe's courts, Philip married Elizabeth himself. The father stole what had been promised to his son, moving with the cold precision of a chess player claiming the queen. The wedding day was agony crafted to perfection. Carlos had to stand there, dressed in tailored clothes to hide his deformities, watching his father marry the woman meant for him. Elizabeth was radiant, young, graceful, everything Carlos could never be. When she spoke her vows to Philip, Carlos heard them as theft, each word meant for him stolen away. Here's the cruelest twist. Elizabeth was kind to him. I watched Elizabeth treat Carlos with real kindness, maybe out of pity, maybe guilt. She called him dear cousin and made a point to include him in court events. But her warmth was like pouring vinegar on a raw wound. Every smile she offered reminded him of what he'd lost forever. Every gentle word underscored what he'd never have. The court saw this emotional torment unfold day after day. At grand state dinners, Carlos sat at the high table, forced to watch his father and Elizabeth side by side. Philip's hand rested on hers with a possessive ease. Their quiet French conversations, words Carlos struggled to follow because of his speech issues, cutting deeper than any blade. The glances they shared hinted at their private moments, moments that should have belonged to him. Carlos's fixation grew like a poison spreading through his veins. He'd position himself to spy on Elizabeth's daily routines. When she strolled through the palace gardens, he trailed her, his uneven steps making it impossible to stay discreet. The scrape of his dragging foot on the gravel paths became a grim joke among the courtiers. You could always tell when the prince was shadowing the queen. He started leaving her gifts, not the kind a suitor might offer, but strange, disturbing tokens. Dead birds arranged in eerie patterns outside her door, locks of his own hair woven into intricate designs. Once, in a chilling act, he left a defaced portrait of her, with Philip's image scratched out and Carlos's own face crudely sketched in its place. Elizabeth, to her credit, handled it with poise. She never let her discomfort show in public, never gave Carlos the reaction he seemed to crave. But her ladies-in-waiting whispered that she'd started bolting her chamber doors at night, glancing nervously over her shoulder when alone. The confident French princess who'd arrived in Spain now moved through the palace like a deer sensing a predator. The breaking point came during a masked ball at court. Emboldened by wine and the cover of his mask, Carlos approached Elizabeth mid-dance. As the musicians played, he leaned in and whispered something that drained the color from her face beneath her mask. She excused herself at once, and Philip's icy glare followed his son, sharp enough to chill the blood. No one ever learned exactly what Carlos said that night, but from then on, Elizabeth was never alone with him. Guards were quietly stationed to shadow her whenever the prince was near. Their interactions were confined to public events, where countless eyes tracked every word and gesture. Carlos's humiliation festered into something uglier than mere resentment. He started telling anyone who'd listen that his father had robbed him of his life, his future, his very reason for being. His rants grew sharper, more violent, filled with talk of revenge and reclaiming what was rightfully his. His mind, already a powder keg of bitterness and suspicion, was ready to ignite. All it took was one small jolt to set it off, a simple staircase. In 1562, Don Carlos chased a servant girl down a stone stairwell. He never reached her. His broken body betrayed him, and he fell. The girl's only crime was catching a glimpse of his bare, twisted foot without his specially made shoes, her gasp of shock sparking his fury. She darted down the narrow service stairs, and Carlos gave chase, his lurching gait turning his rage into a deadly misstep. His stronger leg overcompensated for the weaker one, his misshapen skull throwing off his balance. Witnesses said he seemed to hang in the air for a split second, arms flailing wildly, before gravity pulled him down. The crack of his head hitting the stone rang through the palace like a death knell. Then silence. For 3 days, Carlos lay unconscious, his fractured skull, already malformed, now split like a cracked egg. Fluid seeped from his ears, and his breaths came in shallow, rattling gasps that sounded like the end was near. Philip called every doctor in Spain, promising riches to anyone who could save his heir. The physicians tried every trick their medieval knowledge offered. They bled him until his sheets were stained red, applied poultices of crushed beetles and mercury, and chanted prayers in Latin, Greek, and Hebrew. Nothing helped. Carlos's fever soared. His skin so hot it seemed ready to burst into flame. Then Dr. Pinter proposed a desperate measure. Trepanation, drilling into the skull to release the evil humors trapped inside. It was a procedure that killed more often than it saved. But with Carlos already fading, Philip gave the nod. The surgery happened at midnight, the doctors believing the moon's alignment might aid healing. They cleared Carlos's room, leaving only the medical team and 2 burly men to hold the prince if he stirred. The sound of the drill grinding into bone echoed through the palace walls. Servants later said that sound haunted their dreams for years. That awful, scraping invasion of his skull. Here's the part that turns your stomach. Carlos woke up during it. Halfway through, his eyes flew open. The doctors recorded that he didn't scream. He just stared at the ceiling, fully aware as they bored into his head, his lips moving in what might have been a prayer or a curse. The men pinned his convulsing arms as his body fought, while the surgeon pressed on with his grim task. When the skull finally gave way, the release was audible. A wet, sucking sound as blood and fluid drained out. The surgeon slid a silver tube into the hole to keep it open, letting the poison escape. For 2 weeks, Carlos lingered between life and delirium, a hole in his head. In his fevered dreams, he rambled about Elizabeth, his father, and conspiracies. Some real, some imagined. He spoke to phantoms, even holding conversations in Portuguese with his long-dead mother, a language he'd never learned. The doctors scribbled notes, trying to sort ravings from confessions. Then, against all odds, the fever broke. Carlos's eyes cleared, he recognized faces, and he even ate solid food. The court erupted in celebration. The heir was spared, a sign of God's mercy on Spain's throne. But something had shifted deep inside him. The Carlos who woke wasn't the same one who fell. The trauma had rewired his already broken mind. Where there'd once been cunning cruelty, now there was just raw, unhinged madness. He grew convinced everyone was out to get him. He'd make servants taste his food for poison and slept with knives tucked under his pillow. He started keeping lists, names of enemies with detailed plans for their punishment once he was king. Most chilling of all, he stopped talking about his father with just resentment over Elizabeth. Now it was something colder, more deliberate. He'd pose questions to foreign ambassadors, hypothetical but pointed. What happens when a prince must remove an unfit king? How have other kingdoms dealt with a monarch who's lost divine favor? What emerged from that sickbed wasn't just a cruel boy or a scorned suitor. It was a paranoid, raving creature openly plotting to kill his own father. And King Philip was paying attention. In his shadowy, cavernous study, Philip sat clutching a letter. It was a spy's report, confirming his worst fear. His son, the heir to Spain's throne, was scheming treason. The letter laid out Carlos's recent meeting with Don Juan of Austria, Philip's half-brother. I learned that Don Carlos had hatched a plan to escape to the Netherlands, where Spain's grip was already slipping under the threat of rebellion. He aimed to present himself as a liberator, a better choice than his father, promising freedoms Philip withheld. The enemies of the Spanish Empire would flock to his side, and civil war would tear through the realm. Philip set the spy's letter down, his hands steady despite the weight of its words. Around him, maps lined the walls, charting an empire that stretched from the Americas to the Philippines, held together by the sheer force of the Spanish crown. One unstable prince could bring it all crashing down. But this wasn't just about protecting an empire. It was about a father's love clashing with a king's duty. Philip had done everything to save Carlos, forgiving his outbursts, ignoring his threats, chalking up every cruel act to sickness rather than malice. Even now, part of him wanted to torch that letter and pretend he'd never seen it. The king demanded more reports, and they painted a grim picture. Carlos had been stashing weapons in his rooms. He'd tried bribing guards to spill secrets about palace defenses. Worst of all, he'd sent coded messages to Spain's known enemies, probing their willingness to back a coup. What made Philip's decision so heart-wrenching was that he understood his son's anger. He knew he'd failed Carlos as a father. The boy's twisted body, his fractured mind, his cruelty, all traced back to the choices of Philip's ancestors, to the bloodline he'd continued. Every deformed bone in Carlos's frame stood as a testament to Habsburg arrogance. Philip began his response with painful care. He placed loyal servants in Carlos's orbit, men who reported every whisper. He had the prince's weapons quietly removed during routine cleanings, hoping Carlos wouldn't notice. One last time, he tried to reach his son, inviting him for long walks to talk about legacy, duty, and the heavy burden of a crown. Carlos answered with growing suspicion, accusing his father of poisoning him, stealing his birthright, and ruling as a tyrant who'd lost God's favor. At one dinner, he stood before the entire court and declared Philip unfit to lead, proclaiming Spain needed fresh blood, not an old man's timid grasp. The silence that followed could have deafened a man. The world beyond Spain made waiting impossible. Philip's spies warned that foreign courts were watching closely. If Carlos bolted and posed as a wronged prince seeking justice, he'd find allies. The French would wield him against Spain, and the Dutch Protestants would rally to his cause, toppling Europe's fragile balance into chaos. Philip started writing letters, dozens of them, to every major court, not with commands or threats but with careful words. He spoke vaguely of Carlos's illness, framing it as a father's burden and a king's grim duty. He was laying the groundwork, ensuring the world would understand when he acted. The final blow came in January 1568. Carlos had confided in his closest servants, revealing a plan to flee within days, first to Italy, then to the Netherlands. He had promises of safe passage and whispers of support, believing in his madness that he could return leading an army to claim his throne. One of those trusted servants was Philip's spy, and within hours, the king knew it all. That night, Philip made his decision. He called for his battle armor, not the ceremonial kind, but the real deal forged for war. His advisors were baffled. No enemy army was at the gates. No rebellion needed quelling. In January 1568, King Philip, clad in armor, confronted his son, Don Carlos, not as a father but as Spain's unyielding ruler. Carlos, the empire's heir, was confined in a tower room after his arrest, a princely cell with barred windows. His frail body withered, his shorter legs shriveled, bed sores festered, and his mind unraveled. Isolation fueled paranoia. He spoke to phantoms, dined with his dead mother, and held counsel with empty chairs. Refusing to bathe, convinced of poison, he let sores ooze and his room reek of decay. Philip received daily reports of his son's gruesome decline, physical and mental, but did nothing, letting madness consume his heir. No doctors were sent, no treatments allowed. Carlos was left to rot, just as he claimed. His moments of clarity were almost worse than his madness. He'd suddenly grasp where he was, what was happening, and scribble frantic letters to his father, some pleading for mercy, others spitting venomous threats. Philip kept every letter but never answered, his silence sharper than any blade. By July, Carlos could hardly walk. His muscles had wasted away, his skin hanging loose on his misshapen bones like a poorly fitted cloak. Servants said he'd drag himself across the floor rather than ask for help, leaving bloody trails from sores on his knees. Even in his madness, his pride wouldn't let him show weakness. He grew obsessed with ice, demanding bucket after bucket of ice water in the stifling Spanish summer. He'd gulp it down, then douse his fevered head, as if trying to quench the fire in his mind or freeze out the insanity consuming him. On July 24, 1568, a servant found him unconscious in a puddle of ice water. His lips were blue, his breathing so faint it was barely there. They carried him to his bed. He was so light by then, one man could lift him alone. For hours, he hovered between life and death, muttering in languages he'd never learned, calling out to people long gone. Then, with startling clarity, he opened his eyes and spoke his final lucid words. "Tell my father I forgive him." Was it true forgiveness or a final, cruel jab? forcing Philip to live with that mercy? No one could tell. Hours later, Don Carlos of Spain died at 23. The official record called it a natural illness, with no mention of the imprisonment or the months of decay. In 1568, Spain's heir, Don Carlos, died under mysterious circumstances. Officially, he succumbed to illness, but his father, King Philip, swiftly erased his existence. Portraits were destroyed, letters burned, and court records scrubbed. Carlos's arrest by Philip, clad in armor, was quick and final, ending in a tower room where he died 6 months later. No grand funeral honored him. His tomb bore only his name and dates. Servants were silenced or sent away, and the tower room was abandoned. Philip's meticulous erasure left no trace of Carlos in official histories. Yet, 2 centuries later, Carlos's story resurfaced. German playwright Friedrich Schiller reimagined him as a romantic hero in Don Carlos, and Giuseppe Verdi's opera turned him into a tragic lover, erasing the disturbed prince who committed cruel acts. Philip controlled the narrative, but artists filled the void with a noble, doomed Carlos. Today, audiences weep for Verdi's fictional prince, while the real Don Carlos, broken by mental and physical decay, remains forgotten, his story refusing to stay buried.